retired attorney and a former member of the Vermont House of Representatives, as well as a town moderator. Today's talk will be filmed and shared with the Manchester Historical Society so we can preserve these stories for future generations. Please welcome Mike, and thank you for coming.
As if it wasn't intimidating enough to be up here, I now hear that I'm going to be part of the Manchester Historical Society archive. I want to welcome you all to the first day of mud season. My mid-February memories usually revolve around preparing for town meeting and my years in the legislature from 75 to 80. So I thought I'd start out with my favorite town meeting story, which I actually stole from Harvey Carter. And Harvey was a young attorney just admitted to the bar after going to Duke Law School, and he was living in Pownell at the time. He had never been to a town meeting, so he went with some trepidation and a lot of anticipation of seeing direct democracy in action for the first time. And so he went through the drudgery of the usual articles that have to be considered, and then they got to the point where it came to hear and act upon the report of the overseer of the poor. Now, back in the early 60s, each town in Vermont had an overseer of the poor, and there was no state welfare system except for some reimbursement from the Department of Social Welfare. So partway through the hearing of that report, there was a farmer who stood up in the back and said, "Do I see on page 64 that the town spent $732.34 to the Putnam Memorial Hospital for Mary Jones to have her baby?" And the overseer said, "Yes, that's correct." And he said, "Do I see on the next page that we were reimbursed $752.36? And the overseer said, "Yes, that's correct." And the farmer turns to the moderator and says, "Mr. Moderator, I move that we breed her again." Customs vary from town to town regarding town meeting, and when I was a rep, I tried to go to as many of the 5 meetings in my district as I could, always making sure to go to Landgrove where they had the best lunch. Yeah. I learned that from Warren Beatty, my seatmate. And in Peru, Angus Black had been moderator for many years at that point, and he had what he referred to as Procedure 1. So in Peru, they elected all their officers from the floor. There was no Australian ballot. And so if there was one nominee for an office and Angus didn't see anyone else standing up to make a motion, he would say, "Procedure 1," and call for the vote. And if Procedure 1 passed, that obviated the need for a motion to close nominations and a motion for the clerk to cast one ballot for the sole nominee. So that, in my mind, is a good example of Vermont ingenuity and dislike of wasting time on formalities. I also have a memory of a Peru town meeting that I went to. This one actually stretches over 2 years, so you'll have to bear with me. But the first year I went, David Van Scoter was the chairman of the select board. And when he was making his report, he mentioned that the fire department had complained because they had a lot of people renting houses in Peru who would come up and clean out the ashes from the fireplace, put them on the back deck in a paper bag, and wake up a couple hours later finding the place on fire. And when they call it in, they had no idea where they were. They were renting Joe Smith's house from Yonkers. So he said the fire department has suggested that we should have some street signs and street names. So he said we've come up with a list of names for each street in town, and it's our proposal that we put a sign up for any house that has more than any street that has more than 3 houses, and that it be this list, which they passed around to everyone. Well, Ray Farnham, who some of you may know, I see Bill nodding his head, stood up and said, "That's not Lover's Lane, that's Farnham Brook Road, and it's been in my deed since 1869. And so the debate went back and forth for some time, and finally they resolved to appoint a committee to study the issue and report back the next year. And it was to be 1 selectman, 1 fire department member, 1 rescue squad member, and 1 planning commissioner. So the next year they came back and they had revised some of the names, and they had a model of what the signs would look like. And there was the same debate that it's not Lover's Lane, that's Farnham Brook Road. But Ray did not prevail on that one, and they debated for about 2 hours, and finally an old-timer stood up in the back and said, "If we put up all the signs that this committee recommends, we're going to look just like Dorset." They couldn't have had more contempt in his voice if he said Newark. And I talked to the road commissioner a few years ago when I was up in Peru at a planning commission meeting, and I said, "How often do you replace that Lover's Lane sign?" He said, "About 3 or 4 times a year." We've got a stock of them in the highway shed. So, if the town had listened to Ray.
Why did it end up Lover's Lane? What was the?
Because that was the vote of the town to adopt the committee's report. So I often think when I see the sign as I drive by or see it missing that had they listened to Ray, they would have saved a lot of money. Being a lawyer who does title searches, and I always used to do my own, I often delighted in Rupert, and I kind of developed my own rule of law, which is the further away you are from the seat of power, the less attention you pay to the law. And since the town clerk is the law in many small towns, that was my rule about various town clerks. So Rupert being the far extent of Bennington County from the county seat in Bennington, and Bennington County being the furthest from Montpelier, Rupert was about as lawless as they came. And, Arnold Beebe had been the town clerk for many years when I was there, and Rupert, this was in the early 1980s, Rupert was still a dry town. And I see someone nodding their head, so they probably know the punchline to this story. But
No, I don't.
so John Pelton owned Sherman's store at the time in West Rupert, and he was finding that most of his regular customers were now going to Salem to buy their newspaper, because they could also pick up their beer at the same time there and a lottery ticket. So John circulated a petition to allow the sale of malt and vinous beverages, which is the language required by the statute, in the town of Rupert. And Arnold, who was a member of the Disciples of Christ Church across the street from Sherman's store, was very much opposed to the sale of beer and wine in the town. So the notices got published as required in the newspaper and posted around town, saying, shall the town of Rupert vote to allow the sale of malt and vinous beverages? And by statute, that vote has to be by Australian ballot. So about noon, which was roughly halfway through the voting day, someone came in to John and said, why does your sign say vote yes on Article 1? And he said, because we'd like to be able to sell beer and wine. And he said, but that's not the way the question is worded. So contrary to the warning that had been published in the paper and posted about town, when Arnold drew up the ballot, he drew it up, shall the town continue to ban the sale of beer and wine? So a yes meant no and a no meant yes. And so after some consulting with the Secretary of State, the selectmen decided they needed to warn it again, and Arnold needed to publish the ballot to read the same way the warning did, and it was then approved. And ever since, they've been selling beer and wine at Sherman's store. And doing better, because they're not losing all their customers to Stewart's, I guess, in Salem.
How about some Manchester?
I was telling this story to John Whalen, John Lewis Whalen, being Old John to some of you from Arlington. And he said, well, you know, Mike, John used to chew on the end of his tie sometimes. He said, you know, Mike, Arnold kind of inherited that position from his father, who was also a little cantankerous. He said, one time I went over to do a search in Rupert, and it was late January or early February, and the temperature was 0, and at that time the town clerk's office was in a chicken house just outside of JBB's kitchen window. And so John parked his car, and he saw a car already parked there, and the dealer plate on the back indicated it was from Montpelier. So as John went around the building to get to the door, he heard a tap on the kitchen window, and it was Jay, and he was motioning him to come in. So John went in, and he said, don't you want a cup of coffee, John? It's awful cold out there. So he sat down and had a cup of coffee, and Jay kept going to the window every few minutes. So John said, who is that guy out there? Because when he went around the corner, he could see in the window, and there was a guy who had a fur hat on and thick gloves, and he's going through the books like this. So Jay said, oh, he's an auditor from the tax department, but he'll be gone soon. And sure enough, a few minutes later, they heard the car start up and zoom away, and Jay said, there, now we can go turn the heat on. So thinking of cantankerous public servants brings to mind Senator Jack O'Brien, who was the Dean of the Senate from Chittenden County. He was very colorful, and as the Dean of the Senate, he got to make all the procedural motions, not only for the Senate proceedings, but also for joint sessions between the House and the Senate. And if any of you have ever been in the Vermont House chamber, you know there's this row of seats behind the speaker's podium that look kind of like thrones. which I think senators find themselves well suited for. But Jack would stand up to make these motions, and he was probably 5'3", not much taller, a little leprechaun type guy with a wisp of white hair. But according to the legislative directory, his occupation was fight promoter. I don't know how many fights he'd actually promoted, but according to the legend, he had been a rum runner during the Prohibition, going up and down Lake Champlain into Canada to bring a little liquid refreshment to the citizens of the state. But he was well beloved by his constituents, but he always had a little sparkle in his eye, like he had something up his sleeve. So he was noted. My first year there, I was introduced to him when he came down the center aisle of the House. My seat was the second seat on the left down the center aisleway. And he came down during the middle of the prayer one morning that began the service and said in his inimitable voice, "How'd you vote on my bill?" And of course, while I had never met him before, I knew he was talking about his so-called Bop the Cop bill, which was mandatory jail sentence for assault on a police officer, which he had gotten passed in the previous session. So I was,
There's some water.
thanks, getting a little dry here. Great. I was quite relieved to be able to tell him that I was not there to vote on his bill. And he dismissed me with, "You would have voted against it anyway." And I said, "You're probably right." So I actually got to know him pretty well, and one afternoon, my friend Will Hunter, who was a rep from Wethersfield, said, "Hey, Jack and Senator Boylan want to have dinner with us tonight." So the four of us went out to dinner, which was quite a... Will and I were in our 20s, and Jack and Senator Boylan were in their 80s. So it was quite a contrast. And aside from the differences between House members and senators, Will used to say that being in the House was like being in the middle of a circus, because there were all these people around, rustling around. And while going into the Senate was like going into someone's living room. It was very quiet. There was no microphone. Everyone's deferring to each other, which didn't happen much in the House. So we went to dinner, and Jack's first comment was to Boylan, as he called him, Senator Boylan, who was the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. And Jack said, "Hey, Boylan, how did Doyle vote on your bill?" And he was referring to Senator Doyle, who some of you may know as the author of the Doyle poll. And Senator Boylan said, "I don't know how he voted, Jack. I don't keep track of that stuff." And Jack quickly retorted, "What do you mean you don't keep track? How are you going to get even if you don't keep track of that?" So we went on for a while, and then Jack proceeded to tell us the story of how the previous summer he got a call from one of his constituents whose husband had been murdered 25 years ago or something like that. And she said that she had just heard that Governor Salmon had pardoned the murderer of her husband. And she didn't appreciate that much. So Jack said, "I called my nephew Pete and had him drive me over to Montpelier." So when they got to Montpelier, he was greeted at the governor's office by the Secretary of Civil and Military Affairs, who happened to be named Norman James. And so as he's telling Boylan, he said, you know, it was Salmon's valise carrier there, Norman. And so he said, well, the governor's very busy. I'm sorry you can't see him this afternoon. Would you like to make an appointment? He said, I'm not going to make any appointment. I'll sit here until he comes out. So about 10 minutes later, the governor came out, and Governor Salmon was very tall, and of course Jack was very short. But Salmon had this habit of shaking your hand like he was sawing wood with a crosscut saw, and in doing that he pulled you in close to him. So he said, Salmon said, what's bothering you, Jack? He said, what's bothering me? You pardoned a murderer, a convicted murderer. And Salmon said, now, Jack, you know, that man served over 20 years in jail, and why, he was just a young fellow like your nephew Pete here at the time that happened. And Salmon turns to us and says, imagine that, comparing my nephew to a convicted murderer. So Governor Salmon and Jack didn't have much in common after that, even though they were both of the same party. But one of my favorite stories about Jack was, I believe it was 1978, but it was the same year that Will and I went to dinner with him, whatever it was, and he told us about how he'd been to the Winooski Senior Citizens Center just before the session started, and they talked to him about how they wanted to have a pool table in the Winooski Senior Citizens Center. And this is kind of an object lesson in how legislation actually gets passed. So Jack, being the senior most member of the Senate, was on the Appropriations Committee with Boylan, and so when actually the budget hearings of the Appropriations Committee are very boring, and they consist mostly of listening to the bureaucrats come in and try to justify their budgets before the committee. The committee asks a few questions, and then they go on to the next, whoever it is. So they spend months doing that. So Jack made sure he had on his calendar the day that the Office on Aging was going to be presenting to the Appropriations Committee, and when they came in, the person in charge of the Office on Aging at that time was a woman named Jackie Schweenhard, and so when it came time for questions, Jack said, my constituents want a pool table in the Winooski Senior Citizens Center. And she went to her budget printout, which was about this thick, and she's flopping through, and she said, oh, well, Senator, we're going to add another social worker at the Winooski Senior Citizens Center this year, so we won't have any money for a pool table. And he said, they don't want a goddamn social worker, they want a pool table. And so she hemmed and hawed a little bit more, and finally the Secretary of Administration, who was with her, kind of leaned over and talked to her, and I later learned said, don't worry about it, we'll get it put back in the conference committee. So the committee went ahead and voted to amend that budget by taking out the social worker and putting in a pool table and realizing some savings at the same time, and all went well. And when the Senate finally passed the appropriations bill, and now this is in the last days of the legislature because the appropriations bill is the only bill that has to pass before the legislature can adjourn. So at that point, the House had completed almost all of its business and was waiting for reports from conference committee and things like that. So we went over to the Senate to watch the deliberations on the appropriations bill, and Jack was questioned about why they had made the change to the Winooski Senior Citizen Center, and he delivered a stirring defense of what the people wanted and what they didn't want. And the Senate finally passed the bill with the pool table in there. And it went over to the House, and the House immediately asked for a conference committee. And the conference committee went on for a couple of days going over these line-by-line changes. And it was after dinner one night about 7:30, and they were still meeting, and Jack got tired of it and went home to Burlington, called his nephew Pete, and so they broke for dinner at about 8 o'clock, and they came back then, and some outside noticed that Jack was not there. So he said, I move that we remove the pool table for the Winooski Senior Center and instead put in the social worker as the administration had requested. And the motion passed with Jack not being present. And they resolved all the other differences, and they went into the clerk's office, which at the time they didn't have all this stuff computerized, so you had to have the original bill that had all the amendments tacked onto it. It was about that thick by this stage of the game, and they couldn't find the original bill. Well, Jack had put it in his pocket and taken it home to Burlington.
Wow.
So they had to adjourn for the evening.
I guess so.
And they reconvened the next morning and said, Senator Boylan went to Jack and said, Jack, do you have the original bill? And he said, yes, I got it right here in my pocket. And he said, well, I need to have it. We voted it out last night. And he said, does it still have the pool table in it? And he said, no. And he said, then you're not getting the original bill.
Oh my God.
So they reconvened the conference committee, put the pool table back in, took the social worker out, and all was well for Senator O'Brien for another year. I spend this much time on him because he is really a good example of how to be an effective legislator. He had very limited goals, as most conservatives are pretty happy with the status quo. There were very few new things that he wanted. You know, one year it was the Bop the Cop, the next year it was or a couple of years later it was the pool table. But because he had very few issues that he was concerned about, and because he was very meticulous about keeping track of who voted for his bills and who voted against them, he was able to accomplish the things that his constituents wanted him to accomplish. So that was Jack, and there are many more tales I could tell about him, like he had the national news networks were in Montpelier one day because Vermont was about to pass this bill that required legislative approval for new nuclear plants, and it would have been the first state in the nation. And they had the Senate Energy Committee, which had recently been renamed, had the bill in their possession, and they were having a public hearing. And there were 2 Nobel laureates that were going to be expert witnesses to testify, and so they had all, hustled this information to the networks, and there were 3 network cameras there taking pictures of this public hearing. And the Nobel laureates testified, and Marshall Whitten, actually, from Bennington, who used to practice here in Manchester, had been chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. He had been defeated then and was not serving at this time, but he came to testify in favor of this bill. And Marshall delivered his testimony. I should give you a little more background. Jack was very much an opponent of the welfare state, and he used to complain about people on welfare, all this. So one of the laureates had testified that there was more radiation from a colored TV set than there was from a nuclear power plant. And so when Marshall testified, Jack turned to him and said, "Marshall, you have a color TV?" And Marshall said, "Why, no, Senator, I have a black and white." And Marshall turned to him, and everyone tensed up as soon as Jack took the microphone and said, "You want to get a color TV? Go on welfare." That didn't make it on the network news that night, but Jack got his laugh. So we've had a lot of colorful speakers in Manchester at our town meetings as well, which some of you probably remember, like Dick Hayes and Red Cole in his earlier incarnation when he was still red. And I'm sure you have some favorite memories of your own, which we could share if you wanted to. But at this point, I would open it up to any questions you might have about town meeting or the legislature.
Yeah, Michael,
Bill?
do you feel that, the town meeting has always been like Norman Rockwell, and it was a true democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that's still the case now, even though, there are certainly some signs where we only have 200 or 300 people show up, and I have some issues with it myself. I don't attend the town meetings for certain reasons. Do you still feel that it's the best democratic process we have?
Well, I feel very strongly about town meeting. Yes, I believe it's the best process we have. Nothing better has been invented, but it is dying, I agree with you, from lack of participation. And all I would say to you is take a look at the last presidential election, which is not direct democracy. We have to choose amongst the nominated candidates. And many people, I think, feel that they weren't comfortable with either of the candidates. And presidential elections become choosing between the lesser of two evils. And that, to me, is the magic of town meeting and why it's important. It's not just voting yes or no. It's your ability to change the question, modify it, amend it, postpone it, do whatever you want to do with it, which you can't do with an Australian ballot, for instance. And so I feel very strongly that in our town, specifically Manchester, we're getting further and further away from true democracy by design, by making, approval of school budgets by Australian ballot, where all you can do is say no if you don't like it, and you may have to say no 4 or 5 times because even if you say no, the school board has the ability to put the same number in front of you again, or even a higher number than before when they add in the cost of the new election. So to me, it's much more efficient. Yes, it takes time. Yes, not everybody wants to spend that much time, but it's better to be able to amend that budget from the floor, and the school board takes their lumps than coming back 4 or 5 times, usually with a decreasing number of people participating in each one of those votes. So I think that's bad. I think we've also gotten away from electing officers. We don't elect listers anymore in Manchester. There's an article on the warning this year from the selectmen to eliminate town treasurer as an elected office. There's other offices I can't think of right at the moment that we've eliminated in the past. So we're kind of lulled into this feeling of, oh, these people are better equipped to deal with something. But what they're not equipped with is the ability to know how much you can afford to pay, and that can only come from the voters. And I've seen, just in my time as moderator, many times where I think we've had informed discussions at town meeting that have led to different results than may have been proposed by the select board or the school board. And I'd point to this building right here, which the selectmen almost unanimously opposed, but it was passed. And so I say more power to the people. We shouldn't be afraid of it. We shouldn't feel that they're unqualified. If, yes, there are educators who know more about the business of education, full deference to those people, including Greg, but they should be able to convince us of why they feel that's important or not important. And we will all grow from the experience of learning that. And I just think the move to centralize power, whether it's locally or on the state level, is a mistake. And we're not like every other state, and thank God for that. We have a bottle bill, we have Act 250, we have the billboard law. None of those things we would have if we did what everybody else did or what the experts think we should do. So it's time consuming, it requires your input, it requires your thinking about things, and it requires your participation and voicing your opinions. But it's better than being told that something happened, which doesn't appear in the minutes of a meeting, but that's the way it is. Yes?
Very often there are non-binding sort of issues that come up. How appropriate are they to bring to town meeting?
Well, nothing goes on the warning unless it's approved by the select board or petitioned by at least 5% of the voters, and it has to be something that's appropriate for the voters to decide. So I think that my complaint about advisory issues is that it's probably a result of a decision that the select board doesn't want to make, and therefore they can turn around and say, well, the voters did it, we didn't, have anything to say with it. Or it's something that the voters want, but they make it advisory because they have the ability to do that. Martha?
We've been dealing with how to encourage young people, teenagers, and college students, to participate in our civics, in our civic responsibilities. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, being a moderator and watching the town change through the years, how would you encourage the people of the town to encourage young people to participate in the democracy of our town?
Well, I heard something interesting on the news the other day, which I had not thought about before, and this was after the shooting in Florida of the students, which thankfully that has gotten a lot of students involved, at least initially, in advocating their cause. But this person's point was that part of the reason for these shootings is because people don't have a sense of community. And they may have mental problems, but they may have no more mental problems than the general public has, but they feel disenfranchised for whatever reason, and this is how they act out. I thought of that in context and thought there's been one school shooting in Vermont, which was in Essex, which was a large school by Vermont standard, a large community, and it's also kind of it's a suburb of Burlington, and I think the people of Essex probably feel more like they're part of a community of Burlington or Chittenden County in general than they do of Essex, but that's an assumption on my part. The other one that almost happened the other day was in Fairhaven, which is in a Union High School. I think one of the things which is hard to measure, but in light of our consolidation of schools we should think about, which is what is the value of a local community. And part of that value is in preventing things like this, because people know each other and talk to each other. They're not anonymous in a huge crowd. And I think this is kind of getting away from your question, but I think local people, generally young people, need to feel that they are a part of a community. And I think there are many ways that that can be done, but that it's something that should be encouraged, not just for their participation at town meeting, but in other ways. We used to have, not too many years ago, students who were non-voting members of the Planning Commission and the Development Review Board. We don't have that anymore. We don't have any student representatives on school boards. I think it would be a good idea. I would make them voting members, by the way, not non-voting members. If they have enough interest to come and participate and study all the issues that are coming up, they, are as much entitled to vote, in my mind, as anyone else who's a member of that board who may have lived in town for 6 months or something. So I guess that would be my answer. I think we need to make a conscious effort to include young people in all community events. And once, it will make them more aware of the fact that they are members of this community, and this is how you change what happens in your community. If we just defer to, let a select board or a school board, for which it's notable that this year in Manchester, there's no contest for any office. There's, no contest in the Taconic and Greens, although there's only one person to fill the remainder of another person's term. I think that's important. I don't understand why the Taconic and Greens is having a separate meeting in Londonderry from a regular town meeting, because when we adopted the articles, they said that all votes would be by Australian ballot. But we're electing some people at this floor meeting, and we're deciding some questions at that meeting. So I think we have to be intentional about every step we take as a government to include young people, to include all aspects of the community, not just young people, not just old people. It's important to have people who are acting as our representatives, whether it's as a member of the Development Review Board, the Select Board, or any other office in town, represent the entire spectrum of what the community is, and then have open meetings, have actual discussion. Don't have the decisions all be made behind closed doors and approved in open session, or never even be approved publicly. If you want to have people feel like they are a member of the community, and that what they say will be at least listened to, if not heeded. Anyone else? I should have put you all to sleep. Greg.
I'll raise my hand so I could just say something, and I know you're going to have to close in a minute, but I want to go back to that town meeting concept of everybody being able to speak.
Yeah.
Last year, Marge and I went to see the United Kingdom, which is a story about the black leader in Botswana who was chosen and was going to become, he actually became the first president of Botswana. But the people, the British government, was so opposed to him because he married a white woman from
Right.
London when he was studying in London.
Right.
And the whole movie is about all the apartheid and the discrimination against that. And even though in Botswana they had a cultural tradition of having all the men, and not women at the time, but all the men come to an open meeting. When we served in a Peace Corps in Lesotho, we called it a pit sing. You had thousands of people get in the field and vote what they wanted to do. And that's what happened to this guy. He asked the people to come and see if they would support him or not. And they had like 9,000 people get together in a field and say, yes, we want him to be our tribe leader, and we vote for him to be our chief. Even though he married a white woman, we're not going to discriminate like South Africa does. And the British put a ban on it and said, no, you've got to go through all these mechanics. They sent him back to England. They
wouldn't let him come back to Botswana.
Yeah, so before he could, and he finally got back to Botswana, but by then they declared their independence in '68, and
Right.
he became ranked for the first president
Right.
of Botswana, and he got elected.
I saw the movie.
Yeah, you saw that,
Yeah.
so you know how that worked?
Yeah.
But they had these town meetings in Africa years ago, and it
Yeah.
still works. It's not efficient, but the main thing that I learned from that was how the British, who were in power of so many places, they had so many people installed, like in the protectorates and the Union of all the British colonies,
Right.
blocking anything that didn't agree with them, because they were getting so much pressure, like from South Africa, to not let blacks and whites in there because it would destroy the South African thing. So I'm just pointing that out, that they have similar things in other countries,
They do.
such as these open town meetings, and there's good for them. They're inefficient, but I'm just pointing it out.
I
have my 2 cents in.
I try to go every year to the Vermont League of Cities and Towns puts on a seminar they call Town Meeting Tune-Up, I think. I call it Moderators Camp, kind of like deer camp, and people go and tell their horror stories about what happened at their town meeting. But one year we had, a couple of years, we've had Frank Bryan from UVM, who's a political science professor, and who is the acknowledged worldwide expert on New England town meetings. He's published a few books on it. And he pointed out a few things. He pointed to Switzerland, where in some of the Swiss cantons, which would be the equivalent of our states, they have the equivalent of a town meeting every year. And he had pictures of them all seated in rows, and you know, with their good Germanic background there, everything being in order. But it's an outdoor meeting, and you know, as you said, they have thousands of people in the town square here for this meeting. Town meeting is a state holiday, but in our area, that doesn't mean much in terms of buildings, businesses closing or whatever for town meeting. So it becomes harder and harder for some people to be able to participate.
Well, now that it's on Saturday too, our town.
Our meeting, yeah, that was an attempt to
Yeah.
make it more voter accessible, but in our area, Saturdays is a
Big
very
work.
busy tourist
It's a big work
day. If you're in the hospitality business or retail business,
Yeah.
it's not going to help you much, but,
Have they ever talked about changing it back?
yeah. There is no magic time, I don't
Yeah,
think,
I
that
agree.
you can pick where everybody will be available. But, you know, you don't have to have perfect attendance to have an overwhelming vote at town meeting that expresses the will of the majority, I think. It would be great if we could have everybody there, but I don't think anybody wants to make it mandatory attendance.
No.
And if they did, we'd have to mass produce seat cushions to accommodate everyone, I think.
Have a bar.
Martha?
Have a bar.
Yeah.
Has there been any discussion about putting town and school board meetings back together again to bring the parents of the kids, in other words, younger people, with the town who, I think the average age is probably 70, I don't know.
Well-
But to bring them back together so they could hear each other.
Yeah. After last year's vote, we don't have a Manchester School District
Oh,
anymore.
that's right, right. No
So-
point,
There will be no meeting.
right.
They are combining them. Actually, this year, there's, you know, it's Article 1 on the warning this year. I brought my town report with me, which is a school item. And then we go right to the town article. So Article 1 is a Manchester School District informational meeting to elect 2 school directors for a term that will expire on the date the district ceases to exist, pursuant to the merger study report and articles of agreement approved by the State Board of Education on December 20th, 2016. I don't know how you can elect directors to a district that no longer exists, but there you have it.
Until July 1, or June
It's till,
30th.
it's just till, this is like 3 months.
I understand that's what it means, but.
I-
Yeah,
I know we're going over time, but can you take like 2 minutes to tell people about your paper route when you were a kid?
Oh, yes.
Good Manchester history.
It's just a Manchester thing, and you, how many people you had, and what the house, but you could do it in like 2 minutes.
well, Bill had a route as well as I did for the Rutland Herald.
Oh, yes.
George Elwood was our
Yes.
supervisor. And we were not employees of the Rutland Herald, we were independent contractors, independent carrier merchant.
Yeah, very independent.
But my route was kind of in the center of town. And I counted up a few years ago now how many residences I delivered papers to between Malfunction Junction and Ways Lane.
So it's just a little bit up to Stewart's.
Yeah, up to Stewart's. So I just let everyone make a guess as to how many. That doesn't mean every house, but I mean every house that subscribed to the Rutland Herald in that space of space. Georgia used to live in that area.
I know it.
Yeah,
What time, what years?
1959, 1960, around there.
Was the Herald or the Banner predominant back then?
The Herald, because it was the only morning paper.
Yeah.
Banner was done by
I
the
still
Reynolds
get that
boys.
now, but I gotta get the Manchester Journal to see what you guys are all doing.
So how many were there, like,
I had 31 customers
I saw
on Route
30.
7
imagine?
There's not even
between,
that many houses.
There's not that many buildings now, are there?
well, some of the buildings are gone, a lot of them are converted, some of them were
Were they,
multifamily.
they were multi-family?
A couple, a few.
Were the neighborhoods in there still, or were they new at that point, like Hillvale and all that?
Hillvale was after that, but not too long after,
Hillville was the 60s.
later 60s, yeah.
And did you ride a bicycle to deliver your papers?
Yeah,
Of course.
or walk in the winter.
Where did you pick up your papers?
They got
We
delivered to
used
my
to ride our
house.
bicycle to the school
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
until Thompson said, Georgia, you gotta have a license. And we go, no.
I still have my license
We were just kids,
plate
and we
for
go to the town clerk, and there he is with his pipe in his mouth, writes it all out, and I put this little tiny green license plate on my bicycle.
And thus began your life of crime.
There was nothing but downhill after that.
Everything went downhill after that.
Yeah.
So like when, like what was the first house, one of the first houses that got converted to a store, like from that time?
Yeah, I wasn't even
You were
counted.
around.
That wasn't a house, that was Sophia Beebe's barn.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Sophia Beebe was in the building out front that
Right.
most recently was Overland Sheepskin. I'll tell you a story about Sophia Beebe.
Yeah.
And tell people where that is, oh, Overland Sheepskin, yeah.
Yeah, across the street from the Sunoco station now. Lynn Bourne, who is Grub Bourne's father, who was fire chief before him, had just built their house on what's now called Cone Road, off of Wyman Lane. And Sophia Beebe lived in the corner house of Wyman Lane and Route 7. And she used to hire the Reynolds boys, Leo and Bob, to do her yard work. And Wyman Lane was a dirt road at the time. She had a big stone pillar right at the end of Wyman Lane. And then the road kind of wound in from there. Well, she had the Reynolds boys put some rocks out to mark the edge of her lawn because cars used to cut the corner there. And then one summer she started adding to her lawn every few weeks. They'd spread some compost on top of the road and plant some grass seed, move the rocks out, until it got to you could just barely get through with one car width. And Doris Bourne, Phil's mother, was coming through one day to check out the new house, and she scraped the side of her car on one of those rocks. When she got out of her car, she picked up the rock and threw it through the glass porch.
That sounds just like it.
Yeah,
Scoop.
Yep.
Scoopy.
yeah. So after that, the
Things change.
selectmen took notice and had her move her rock back to her property line.
Oh, my gracious.
Either way.
So some of your paper route was on Cottage Street and Lyman Lane where you lived?
I lived on Bonnet Street at that time.
Oh,
But yeah, I had Cottage Street, I had Mountain View Terrace, and
oh, yeah.
Martin Street.
My route was right up this road.
Yeah, north of town.
Yeah,
Yeah.
used to go up to Bischoff's.
Where'd you cut off, Bill, about by the funeral home?
I Miss Zulo.
Okay.
Yeah.
Miss Zulo was the start.
That's Candeleros.
He came over, yeah. I don't know how many I had. That one to Bishops, it was like a half a mile to drive for one basic.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a good point. Basically.
it's
So
kind of
it's
like,
the
I had
brick
Joe
house.
Fowler up on the top of that.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
But he paid me 75 cents.
There you go.
Yeah.
Know where the money is, right?
That's when the paper was only 47
Yeah,
cents a
right.
week. Yeah, he appreciated my huffing up that hill.
You mean on Ways Lane?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming, and make sure you come to see Bill's presentation.